I think they're tremendously useful because they're usually written with an independent perspective, as much as that is possible, and they really delve into what's going on behind the scenes and get into the way government really works, as opposed to what often gets more coverage, which is the politics.
And also, typically, they have greater access to the people who are really doing the work and really making the decisions than anybody outside the government would, which allows them a better capacity to come up with conclusions and, by and large, recommendations for how to make things better.
And usually the choice of what's audited focuses on the issues that are, causing trouble in a state or, rising to the surface for some reason. The audits themselves create news. There were, a couple of years ago, there were some huge audits in Idaho. Actually, they were evaluations done by the evaluation office, but very similar to audits, that uncovered enormous issues in the way welfare was handled in Idaho. In a number of states, there have been breaking stories about foster care because of the problems in getting parents and putting children in places that were good for them, or the medication that children were getting. It is a way of uncovering stories that would otherwise not get covered.
One of the big topics, and this I wouldn't name a single state because it's been in so many states, is fraud, which is the kind of thing you don't know that there's fraud unless you look for it. And one of the things that the auditors typically look for in any agency is whether there's fraud. They talk about fraud, waste, and abuse, but fraud is the one that you can really identify. A lot of work, you can, by and large, tell if they're legitimate by talking to other people in the government and talk to them about the audit that was done about them. So that if, for example, they did an audit about a local audit about the jails, and what I would do before I wrote about the audit is I would talk to the people who are running the jails and say, what do you think of the audit? Who did they talk to? Did they talk to the right people? Did they talk to the wrong people? Now, it may be that at the end of the day, and typically this is the case, the auditor did do all the right stuff, regardless whether or not the jail folks like it.
We've interviewed auditors in, I'd say, almost all of the 50 states and most of the largest local governments. And in general, we have a lot of faith in auditors and the honesty of their approaches. Just sometimes you have to be careful of if they are elected, that they are too partisan in their approach.
The one thing that's important to take note of is that there are two kinds of auditors. There are financial auditors and performance auditors, and the auditors we turn to are the performance auditors, who talk about whether or not the tax dollars that are being spent wisely, well, effectively, and efficiently, as opposed to the financial auditors who just want to make sure that the left-hand column adds up to the same numbers as does the right-hand column. The Volcker Alliance is doing a great deal of really good work if you're looking for budgeting. They do, and we've written, annual reports looking at 5 different areas of budgeting with many academics involved in doing the groundwork. The Government Finance Research Center out of the University of Illinois in Chicago, I should say, is doing some really terrific work. The Government Finance Officers Association comes out with really good work. The National Association of State Budget Officers does terrific twice a year reports on expenditures and on revenues.
I would say that generally the membership organizations of sort of for the top level directors in the states, if you go to those associations, they're associations for the people who are the directors to talk to each other, and they can be very candid, and they come up with good reports and generally very reliable portraits of what's going on across the country.
And where they're very useful, if you develop a relationship, as we try to, is if you're doing a story, a national story about almost anything, and you go to the national organization, you can ask them to point you to the individual cities or the individual states that'll have the best sources and the best examples. Typically, they're not. So I think if you want to make an assumption, assume no. You want to look and make sure that they have full disclosure of the criteria that they use. You want to make sure that the criteria they use don't point things in one direction that has a political bent for it. You want to make sure that their work is timely. One of the big problems with many of the rankings is that they're using 5-year-old data, and 5-year-old data in my world is like no data.